We're going to move into the history now. I call it the hidden history of slavery, and there's so much more than meets the eye. I was a student of history, and I studied American history, I studied European history, and I did not know many of the facts that I'm going to present to you. Now, 1984, which is that book by George Orwell, has two important quotes. He who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future. This is huge. This is huge. There has been a rewriting. Oh, come on. There's been a rewriting of history of the United States and the Western civilization. This has been going on now for over 50 years. I believe a lot of it began with the protests in the 1960s. I was in high school and college in that time. I was in a private Catholic women's college, so I did not participate in protesting. But it was literally a counter-revolution against the establishment. The establishment was everything to do with the Judeo-Christian foundation of this nation, our history, the European culture. There was a challenging of everything. The church, everything was challenged. Now, when they saw that the revolution wasn't working, they decided they had to do something to change the culture, and they did that by becoming college professors. I know I've worked on campuses. I've worked on 2 campuses, and I know how liberal the college professors are. By working on the campuses, they then begin to take control of history. They begin to they rewrote textbooks in schools, in the elementary, high school, and college. They blamed all the ills of the world on the Western culture. I watched at the systematic dismantling of education that I was exposed to as a teacher in my early days, elementary school teacher. History was no longer taught, it was social sciences. Social sciences then morphed into social justice. So much on campuses now, you can get a degree in social justice. I want to state very, very clearly, there is no justice outside of the throne of God. For his foundation of his throne is justice and righteousness. Man can never bring true justice because man's carnal nature will always pervert it, and it will never turn into the true justice that is needed. Now I'm going to go through the known history first. Western slave trade. These are the European traders from the 4th to the 19th century. Now this map, I think, is so incredibly telling. This is the slave trade from Africa to the Americas. With the anger in this nation, you would assume that there was a tremendous number of Africans who were brought to America. It's 500,000. It's 500,000 between 1650 and 1860. Approximately 10 to 15 million enslaved people were transported from Western Africa along this coast to the Americas. Now, these are all the slave routes. These are all the trade routes. I want you to notice there were only a couple slave routes into the United States. One is somewhere up along near Washington, D.C., possibly Baltimore, since that was a major trading city, Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans. There were 500,000. 1/3.3 million went to Europe. 4.5 went to the Western Indies. And I'll describe in a little bit why this is so important. 0.2 went to Central America. We have 5 million going down to Brazil. 0.5 million going to Peru, and then down to Argentina. Now, this is huge. If you look at this, now the reason the 4.5 million into the West Indies and into Brazil is so important is because there was a ready stream of slaves being brought from that west coast of Africa to North and South America. They, in West Indies, in the plantations of West Indies, in the plantations in Mexico, in Brazil, in all of these plantations, It was cheaper to keep on replacing their slaves as they died than it was to develop breeding programs. So in the United States, since they cut off the slave trade early, the only way they could get slaves into this nation was through New Orleans. And then that door closed in 1812 when we bought the Louisiana Territory. So when I was in Haiti, and I was 9 months in Haiti, I studied and I read the book Written in Blood. It was about the Haitian history. And it described the incredible loss of life that happened in Haiti due to the plantations, due to the snakes that were in those sugarcane, due to the diseases that the people coming from Africa were not immune to. So when these Africans were brought in, one thing they did is they brought their diseases from Africa on those slave ships. And not only did the slaves die on the slave ships, but the sailors died on those slave ships. And they brought those diseases into North and South America. But they were then exposed to the diseases that were in South America, North America, the West Indies, and Central America. So there was, just like the exchange, measles and smallpox were enough to wipe out the Native Americans in our nation because we brought those diseases. When nations mix, when they come across, they bring with them the diseases and they are decimated by the diseases there. In Haiti, the French plantation owners could not find French women to marry and to live in Haiti. So they married Black women. And a lot of the struggle of Haiti is a war between the races and the color of skin. Because there was a hatred of the French Blacks, there was a hatred of the French whites, they were hated by the Africans, and were also hated by the poor whites. Because if you were the offspring of this African woman and this Frenchman, you got to go to Paris to be educated. You had position and status in their culture. So I really want you to look at this. I was shocked to see it was only 500,000 slaves. You would have thought, the way our nation is so angry about slavery, that we were bringing in millions upon millions of slaves. And in reality, the reasons that the Africans in this nation survived is because there was the breeding program. Now, it sounds very crass to call it a breeding program, but it preserved the destiny of families. Now, one of the things that surprised me, that in this whole slave trade, there was the enrichment of the royal coffers. You can't imagine my shock when I realized Queen Anne and Queen Elizabeth received 25% of the profit from the sale of slaves by British ships, British slavers. The King of Spain received 22%. Now, this is even more interesting when you consider that Spain did not participate in the slave trade. They were too busy with their plantations and their mines all through Central and South America. So they let the Portuguese and the French and the English and everybody else and the Dutch bring the slaves from Africa. Now, the other point that surprised me is the wealth of the aristocrats. Remember, I said there's aristocrats in every culture. In France, England, and Spain was acquired through slavery and colonial domination. They really enriched their lives. Now let's look at some images of slavery. They're not easy to look at, but we need to look at them. This is the typical image of the slaver putting the men down into the hole. One of the, in my study of history, one tidbit I learned is that as the slaves were before they were placed on the ships, they would go through a gate of forgetfulness. And there would be a witch doctor who would stand at the gate and literally remove their identity, remove who they are. Now, I find it very interesting. Very few Black Americans have any idea where they came from in Africa. If you talk to an Irishman, or an Englishman, it doesn't matter if they came over on the Mayflower, they know who they are. But there was a systematic destruction of the memory of the Blacks that were shipped to to North and South America. This is one of those horrific pictures showing how they were literally stacked as firewood. They would come on board that ship and they would be sick. They would be diseased. They'd been held in prison, almost like in prison, in cells, waiting till they had enough slaves in order to fill a ship. And that disease would be rampant. Now, this is one of those horrible images of, you've got, notice those are like 1650 English gentlemen behind there. This was early. Now, this is one of those images that I find very heartbreaking, is the image of the cotton picking. The families picking cotton, the children are picking cotton. Picking cotton was something that was very difficult to do because the cotton is inside a ball and the ball has thorns on it. So your fingers would get so bloody from picking the cotton. Just really, really difficult to look at. Now, the initial slave traders from Europe were the Portuguese and Dutch slave traders. I found it very interesting just before I started this presentation in the summertime, I found out my mother was 31% Portuguese. When we look at near relatives, going back 2-3 cousins, they're all Spanish names. It's quite remarkable. Now, in the 15th century, the Portuguese began to raid on the west coast of Africa, and they sold these slaves to the Europeans. Now, they were also responsible for taking slaves, Japanese, slaves from India, slaves from Indonesia, because the Europeans had an appetite for that which was unusual. Men often have an appetite for strange flesh that it looks different than what you're used to. 16th century, 10% of Lisbon's population were of African descent. They established slave ports along the west coast of Ghana. The first 10 slave ports were Dutch. Now, I heard an interesting truth about the Dutch in the slave trade. When we did that reconciliation, a man from Holland, a pastor from Amsterdam came, and he said the intercessors were interceding over Amsterdam, which is a really wicked city with the drugs. You know, the drugs in Holland are just unbelievable on the streets. Children of 11, 12 are zonked out on heroin. And he said the intercessors saw the canals of Amsterdam running with blood, full of blood. And when they dealt into it, they had almost 400 years of the records of the slaves that had been sold by the Dutch. Now, we don't get angry at the Dutch. You know, we blame the British, we blame the French. If you're in those parts of the world, you blame the Portuguese. But in reality, the Dutch were also complicit. Now, what's the statistics overall? 11 to 15 million slaves were brought to the Western Hemisphere over 4 centuries. What's very interesting in that amount is it's 1.3% of the annual transport of slaves to the New World in terms of population. 95% of the Caribbean, Central and South America is where they went. 35% to Brazil, 5% to the United States. 15% died in transit. But the most important part was 2 out of 3 were men. And because they were men, the destiny of their families were able to survive because they were brought for the purpose of labor. They were brought for the purpose of making these aristocrats, these plantation owners, wealthy. Now, you have to understand the plantation owners were very often the second or third born son of a wealthy family. Firstborn inherited. He received the wealth and the land in Europe. But the second, the third, the fourth, the other sons, they had to find a way to make their living. And they would make their living with plantations. So if we're going to understand slavery, we've got to understand the roots of it. Why did empires embrace slavery? Were the Africans unique in the history of slavery? What was the history of Africa and slaves? Who used slaves for wealth acquisition? So for the first question, why did empires embrace slavery? Spoils of war. If you look at every war, especially the wars that happened many, many generations ago, well, not even that far, we can take Russia in World War II. They used the conquered people for slaves, or they would demanded slave tribute from the conquered people. Think about Russia. Do you realize that with Stalin, he wanted to mix up all of the people in those Eastern Bloc nations. So he began to send them to Siberia to work in the mines and in the forest. And he sent Siberians into their nation, into their different communities. It was so that they could never rise up together as a people with any sense of belonging and I'm looking for a word, loyalty. Slaves are a source of wealth. And they use the labor forces for their armies. For the rowers, remember the Mediterranean, the ships required when they couldn't sail with the wind, they had men who rowed. Not only did the Romans do that and the Phoenicians, but also the Vikings. They worked in the fields, they worked in the mines, they worked in the households, and they were concubines. Was Africa unique in the history of slavery? Not at all. Every victim people group in the world has been enslaved. It's not a race issue. It's a power issue. It's a domination issue. So in China, there would be tribes in China and they would be enslaved. In India, the same thing was going on. Southern Europeans, Africans, natives. Now, in this whole story, the African empires were complicit. There were pre-colonial kingdoms of Dahomey and Ashanti. This is Benin and Ghana. The Europeans that were coming and trading were really junior partners in this whole endeavor. This was a business. And the business was the rulers that were making the big money, the merchants who were doing the sale, and the middlemen who would have been those sailors, those captains of the slave ships that were transporting them to the New World. What it said about Africa, Africa was called the white man's grave. You have to understand that the diseases of Africa were so incredibly difficult for Europeans. You've got malaria, you've got yellow fever, you've got all of these diseases. And even the sailors were dying from the diseases. There were elite coastal rulers who controlled the coast and the rivers. They weren't going, the image of the white man going into innermost Africa and capturing people and kidnapping them out of their villages is a myth in reality. I do not believe that was the common means of obtaining slaves. And I could be wrong, but I don't believe I am. Now, this is an image I saw, and it shows who's guarding this long group of slaves. It's a black man with his gun. So how were the slaves acquired? Well, there's local warfare. And it's what happens when you conquer a people, you conquer an army, you take your captives and you enslave them. There was kidnapping, but there was also a manipulation of the religious and judicial systems of the African kingdoms. We know the courts of law are not always just. We know religious systems can also come down with a ruling against a person, and then they would be decreed that they would be enslaved. Now, they profited by the enslavement of their rivals. Can't you see it? I mean, that's the story of Joseph. His brothers were rivals, enemies, the poor, other culturally different groups. Remember, there's many, many different tribes. And some tribes were extremely powerful, like the Zulus. They were never conquered. But there were other tribes whose personalities were not as vicious is warlike. So what's the unknown history? This is the part that really just horrified me, that I never knew. Where were the early slave trade routes in Africa? I want you to look at this. They're starting in Cairo. They're in Jeddah, Barqa. They're up in Marrakech and Algiers and Tunisia. And there's all these different early empires. Noticing this is the Eastern slave route. We talked about the Western slave route. So let's talk about the Eastern slave route and the Trans-Saharan slave route. So this was an image. It was easy to find many pictures of Arab sheiks in their gowns purchasing Black women. Notice most of these are Black women and children. Now, what's the history of slavery in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe? We know from our Bible that the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt and when they're in Babylon, they were a captive people. They had to work, they had to labor. Now, when you think about Egypt, remember when they came out of Egypt, the mindset of slavery was still in them. That's why they saw themselves as grasshoppers. The trauma of the slavery was still holding them in captivity until all of them died off. Now you've got the Berbers were enslaved by the Phoenicians. Now the Phoenicians are coming from that coast over by Israel. They were enslaved to be working the plantations and to be rowers in their major ships. The Romans relied on war captives from their European campaigns. Now these European campaigns would be Germany, it would be in England, it would be all through France, Spain, Portugal. The Jewish revolt, they took the people captive as part of the diaspora of the Jews, and then slave offspring. So they weren't looking to Africa. An African slave would have been uncommon. Now, in 433 AD, the first African slaves were from Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria. This is North Africa, and for the purpose to meet the needs of Egypt and Arabia. Now, there was European suffering in all of this, which is kind of a hidden in the history. The Vikings took slaves from the western coast of Europe. They would periodically raid Ireland, Scotland, England. In fact, Dublin was known as a slave trading capital, where many of the slaves were sold. And they went all the way into the Mediterranean. And in further research, I found out that the Vikings did a healthy trade with the Arabs in Baghdad. They found all of this Middle Eastern money in the tombs of the wealthy of the Vikings, including jewelry that the women were wearing. Now, there was another part of this. There was what was called the reaping of the steppes by the Ottoman Empire. This was a term I had never heard. The Ottoman Empire, they would literally, periodically send up their armies for the sole purpose of taking women and children captive. They would go as far as Moscow. This is the Ukraine. This is Yugoslavia. This is Czechoslovakia. This is Romania. These are those nations who during the time of the Soviet Union were enslaved. I find it very interesting that they were enslaved. They were taken into slavery. Their women were taken from them, going back, not even certain how many years. But they were taken as to be concubines down in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, all through that part of the world, and probably into India. Now, another interesting fact is 250,000 Irish were indentured in the Caribbean. Now, for the Irish to be indentured in the Caribbean, you have to understand they would be like the Europeans. They would not be able to survive the diseases that they would come across. The heat, the sun. I hate the sun. I hide. Whenever I'm in a place like that, I am hiding in the shade. I cannot imagine being indentured and working on the plantations in the Caribbean. But they had limited servitude if they survived the 7 years, and they were not inherited. The other portion that's really interesting is different European nations established penal colonies. English prisoners, and this could also be the poor, were sent to Georgia, Virginia, and Maryland, and the French to Louisiana. I wonder how much this has impacted the history of Georgia, Virginia, Maryland, and Louisiana because of the criminals that were sent there, just like Australia was established as a penal colony. And it has definitely had an impact on Australia. Now let's talk about Muslim slavery. The ideology of Islam means submission. That's what it means. Islam means to submit. They would demand tribute from conquered tribes. A horrifying fact was the word for African in Arabic means slave. Think about that. The very word is slave. The Quran gave them the right to enslave unbelievers. And another interesting tidbit is, if you became a believer in Islam and Allah, you were freed. I wonder how many nations like Indonesia, Malaysia, that are in parts of Africa that are all now Islamic nations, became Islamic nations as people embraced Islam to be freed from the curse of slavery. Now, in the conquest of India, and these would be the Mughals, it led to hundreds of thousands of slaves. The Muslims from 644 AD required annual tribute from these nations of 360 women and children from their conquered people groups. Oh, come on. Now, there was a very momentous decision that really decimated Africa in ways that have never been attributed. I find it very interesting that Black Americans embrace Islam, but they don't know their history. In 734, a Trans-Saharan trade route was established. What this is mean they are now going across the Sahara Desert. The motive? Greed. It was a huge financial enterprise. The Berbers, with the nomads of the desert, provided the resources and protection for the Arab caravans. If they didn't provide the resources, if they didn't provide the cities, the water, the food for these caravans to go across this desert, they would have never done it. But who are the behind-the-scenes sponsors? Turkish bankers, Arabia and Saudi Arabia, and Jewish merchants. There was a whole Jewish family that converted to Islam that became a part of this slave trade. Now, what's the reality of the Arab slave trade? It's 645 AD to present day. We know in Sudan, they were kidnapping the people from southern Sudan and selling them into slavery. Some calculations are that there was 180 million slaves were taken from Africa, Asia, and Europe. Now, that's an outrageous number. Remember, 11 to 15 million were taken from Africa to the New World. We have the Ottoman Empire, which was harvesting the steppes of Eastern Europe, Balkans, and Caucasus. 2 out of 3 women were for concubines, and the men were castrated. The worst statistic is 85 to 90% died in transit as they crossed the Sahara Desert. Now remember, you've castrated the men. This is in a time when there isn't any antibiotics, and those men would die of infection. Far fewer of this 180 million survived in the Middle East. There was such a destruction of the destiny of families with the castration of the men. Here's a picture. It shows a harem. Notice the different colors of the women. The dancers, the white women, the black women, all for the pleasure of the sheiks and his concubines and his harem. Here's another picture. Here they're selling. You've got the little black slaves there in front, and you've got the little white girl. And they're measuring out the gold. How much does this one cost? Now, another group that was involved in this trade is the Tuareg Berber tribes, 16th, 17th century. Remember, the Berbers were very involved in the Trans-Saharan. They saw that it was a lucrative business, so they began to raid the European coastline of southern and western Europe as far as Iceland. Now, when they raided, you have to understand, they would row up the rivers. Unless you were deep inland, you were not safe on the coast of Europe. They would impound sailors. And then the fact was, Baltimore, Ireland was emptied by them. And it took decades before people ever returned to that city. And women and children were prized by the sultans of Arabia. It's always the women and the children. It's always the women and the children. And they're taken out of their culture. That's what I've heard about, oh, how horrible it was for the Africans to be taken to the New World. Well, for those 5 million that were taken to South America, taken to Brazil, it would be very similar to where their coastal Africa, west coast of Africa. But think about someone from Iceland being taken to Arabia, to the deserts of Arabia. Every group has suffered. Every group has lost. Nobody knows who they are. The truth is, oppressor nations have always used conquered people for slave labor. The Nazi Germany war machine, its manufacturing, they were taking the slave labor of the Jews, of the Poles, of the people that they conquered, and they were forcing them into these work camps, and they were dying there. The Japanese, the Soviet Gulag, 20 million people disappeared in the Soviet Gulag. When I went to Siberia, all I could do was weep for 3 weeks. Pol Pot in Cambodia, when they were taking the people from the cities and for re-education, they took them as slaves out into the countryside. China, North Korea, going on today, the enslavement of their people. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, the stealing of the kidnapping of those schoolgirls. Hundreds of schoolgirls have been kidnapped and forced into marriage with Muslim men and forced to deny their faith. I also want to throw in here the serf system in Europe and Russia. Now, when slavery was no longer common in Europe, the people were still tied to the land of the Lord. They had no right to move. They had to work for the Lord. They had to give a certain amount to pay for the land that they had. They were not free. They were not free. Now, I'm going to shift gears right now, and I want you to know there are more slaves now. There are more slaves now than at any time in history. This is really horrifying. I have been praying and engaged in prayer work for human trafficking, but this was so much worse than I ever realized. I want you to look at this map of modern slavery. You'll notice that the nations that were involved in slavery from the very beginning, the Asia Pacific, the Sub-Saharan Africa, are still the nations with the most enslavement of people. 30 million in Asia Pacific, 6.245 million in Sub-Saharan, the Middle East, which is kind of a neutral ground. It's showing almost 3 million enslaved there, almost 3 million in Russia and Eurasia. Then you take Europe, which is low, according to this chart, especially Greenland. I can't imagine anybody living in Greenland. And then our Americas. Now, I don't know that these statistics are true. I believe they're probably much worse. Personally, I have always supported a child from Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, India, because I did not want them enslaved. I've been doing that for many years. So estimated number of people in modern slavery, 4.58. 58% of those living in slavery, that's 58% of the 45 million, almost 46 million, are from 5 countries: India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Uzbekistan. I want you to notice these are not Christian nations. The countries with the highest proportion of their population in modern slavery are North Korea, Uzbekistan, Cambodia, India, Qatar, Pakistan, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, South Sudan, Somalia, Libya, Central African Republic, Mauritania, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. I think the one that surprised me the most was Dominican Republic. You'll notice that that is the only Christian nation that is listed there. So, estimated 48.54 million people in modern slavery around the world, 10 million are children. 24.9 million are in forced labor. 15.4 million are in forced marriages. Those are those child marriages, which absolutely destroy the woman, that young child. 4.8 people are in forced sexual exploitation. In terms of those forced marriages, they wreak havoc with the young child's body. A child was never meant to have intercourse with a full-grown man. 1.5 million people are enslaved in developed nations. I believe that's really probably much worse than it shows there. 16 million slavery victims are exploited in economic activities. Those would be working on plantations, in mines, the blood diamonds in Africa. I remember reading a history of Vietnam, and it talked about the enslavement of the people on the rubber plantation, the French rubber plantations. 4.8 million people are sexually exploited. 99% of the people trafficked for sexual exploitation are women and girls. It continues today. What has been happening from time eternal. 4.1 million people in slavery are exploited by their own governments. Think of North Korea, think of China. It said in the US, 150 billion is in illegal profits from forced labor in the private economy is generated per year. Think about that, 150 million. These are people being forced to work on farms. You know, and we're supposedly so compassionate. We should open our border so that these people who run these sweatshops, who run these enslavement farms, can get cheap labor without taking care of them. Someone's in slavery if they are forced to work through coercion, mental or physical threat. That's the definition of enslavement. They're owned or controlled by an employer through mental, physical, or the abuse or the threat of abuse. And they're dehumanized and treated as a commodity and bought and sold as property. They're physically constrained or have restrictions placed on their freedom of movement. Now, when we were in India, we've been to India now for 4 months total, over 2 years. We saw many of these smokestacks, and these are where they make their bricks. I did not know it was the children, the enslaved children, that were making the bricks. So there's different forms of modern slavery. There's forced labor. There's debt bondage. This is most common form of slavery, especially in the nations that are extremely poor. When people have to borrow money, they cannot repay. They're required to work to pay off the debt. This can be for medical reasons. This could be for whatever reason. But when you borrow money and you're poor, I think of the people who are trying to get to America and they borrow money so they can pay off these coyotes to bring them across the border, to leave them to die in the desert of the Southwest United States. They borrow money, and if they're sent back from the border, they're in big trouble because they have to repay it. There's human trafficking, always involves the transporting, recruiting, harboring people for the purpose of exploitation, using violence, threats, or coercion. There's much human trafficking of women that's coming out of the steppes, coming out of Eastern Europe. And these women are trying to get a better life for themselves. They answer an advertisement where they can come to America and they're going to have work for them and they will give them passports. And as soon as they get here, they take their passports and they now are in prostitution. One of the worst things I hate is the children being made into the child soldiers. They're kidnapped from their villages. Their parents are murdered. They're forced to do horrific things for the purpose of brutalizing them to such a way that they can be used for slaughter of other villagers. What are some other types of modern slavery? Some people are inherited. They literally are born into slavery because their ancestors were slaves, and they'll remain in slavery by descent all their life unless they can be purchased out. You've got child slavery occurs when a child is exploited for someone else's gain, child trafficking, child soldiers, child marriage, and child domestic slavery. I've read several instances of people who've been enslaved by the Saudis who come to this country and work in DC, and they bring their slaves. And these people, when they come to DC, they attempt to get free, and they'll go to court and they'll let someone know what's really going on at great danger. And they'll lie about them. Oh, they had this great life working for us. Right. And then we've got everyone that's forced into an early marriage. It's when someone's married against their will and cannot leave the marriage. Boko Haram. It's an example of them doing the blood diamonds. I know those men have guns. Here's a woman. What happens when a woman is exploited in human trafficking? And then Nigeria, bring back our girls now. I have a friend, she's very, very involved in that campaign. And I say a prayer and I say, bring back the girls now. There are parents who have died of a broken heart because their daughters have been gone. Okay. Now I hope this has impacted you as strongly as it has impacted me. I know that this is going to be a journey that we're going to go on. There's going to be several videos. I thought 3, but I believe out of this, as Valerie has said to me many times, this is going to be a book. And so I really, really want you to begin praying about this. Because in our DNA, we have the trauma of being enslaved. Jesus was enslaved. He was sold for 30 pieces of silver. Now, they didn't make him a slave to work, but they owned him, and they could punish him, and they could kill him. So I really want us to look at this, because there's a trauma that happens to the DNA of people who've been enslaved. So it's the epigenetic tags in the DNA, the negative turns on, and that's inherited from generation to generation. We see this in the Holocaust survivors, in their children and in their grandchildren, the same terrors and fears that they have inherited from their ancestors. We have to be able to find the keys that set people groups free. We have to find the keys that will free the Black Americans in this nation from the trauma of slavery. Set them free from the bitterness and the hatred. Set them free from the wounded, bruised heart that is generationally passed on as they remember the horror. This is going to be an important journey, and I thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you. Good night.